بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الفاتحة بنية حفظ الظاهر والباطن وبأن الله ينور قلوبنا وقوالبنا مع التقى والهدى والعفاف والغنى والموت على دين الإسلام والإيمان بلا محنة ولا امتحان. إلى حضرة سيدنا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا رسول الله محمد بن عبد الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه، وإلى أرواح العلماء العاملين وصوفية المحققين وأهل الذكر والتوحيد ومشايخ هذه الأمة بأن الله يتغشاهم بالرحمة والمغفرة ويعلي درجاتهم في الجنة وينفعنا بأسرارهم وأنوارهم وعلومهم ونفحاتهم في الدين والدنيا والآخرة. الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Just a sound check. If I speak like this, will the audiences can you capture my voice? Testing. Well, all right then. Alhamdulillah. Today, this is perhaps our last discussion based on the book Educational Philosophy and Practice of Sayyid Muhammad Naqib al-Attas, an exposition of the original concept of Islamization by our teacher, Professor Wan Muhammad Nur Wan Daud. It's been quite a journey for us since we have started even before Ramadan, and throughout the month of Ramadan, for every Sunday we have been discussing chapter by chapter of this book. Of course, I do not pretend to have done justice to the work, because what is contained within this work, this volume on the Islamization is much more than what can be covered, say, within the weekly 1 hour sessions that we do have discussed. But I just hope to have given an introduction and opening to the major chapters of the book so that it becomes a bit more accessible. The last time that we met during the month of Ramadan, we discussed the chapter on the Islamization of knowledge, both the theoretical and the practical dimensions, as exemplified in history, first and foremost by the impact of the Quran itself on the immediate vicinity or the immediate audience of the Quran, the people of the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and then how gradually this Islamization process impacted other languages also with their own worldview, with their own cultural and philosophical understandings of the world, wherever Islam went, including, of course, the Malay archipelago, in which the scholars, the pioneers of the Islamization process in this part of the world, have elected the Malay language to be the vehicle for this process. And such, the vehicle serves as a good artifact, shall we say, a living artifact of how the process of Islamization focuses on matters of belief, theology, worldview, metaphysics, that becomes changed as a result of the introduction of the worldview of Islam. And Professor Naqib al-Attas has chosen especially the writings of the mutakallimin, the theologians, the writing of the metaphysicians amongst the Sufis, and also the philosophical concepts amongst the falasifa that were being discussed by our great scholars such as the likes of Sheikh Nuruddin al-Raniri and before him Hamzah al-Fansuri. What became evident to him studying all these treatises was that there was a process whereby the worldview of the people came to reflect more and more the worldview as projected by revelation. And this process, which focuses on the role of language and its impact upon the mind and our conception of the world and reality, now this process he calls Islamization, which is a liberating process. And then moving on from the historical dimension, we also discuss the biographical aspect of Professor Naqib al-Attas, in which he founded several youth movements like ABIM and the Islamic Academy of Science, and pioneered the founding of the Islamic Academy of Science, IBKKM, and finally in its culminating form in ISTAC, whereby he established an institution for the purpose and the focus of Islamization of knowledge, or to be particular, Islamization of contemporary knowledge amongst its other goals, which includes, of course, the study of civilization, and from time to time to publish its work, to study Islamic art and architecture, and of course the civilizational aspect of Islam also, and its impact upon world history. Now today we want to pursue the object of discussion today, or the subject of discussion is the last chapter, wherein Professor Wan Muhammad Noor titled it "Responses to the Islamization Process." Of course, as a movement, this Islamization of contemporary knowledge has the potential of being an epistemic revolution. Now, this term epistemic revolution, what it means is that it has the potential to overturn the habits of mind that we are now being accustomed to. It is necessary. It is natural, of course, just as political revolutions will cause anxiety, will cause a certain sort of apprehension and rejection in others. Similarly, in the case of epistemological revolution, we are bound to sustain, say, negative impacts. Now, the notion of epistemic revolution has happened throughout the history of knowledge, throughout the history of ideas. If we look at the history of ideas in the West, for example, even the rise of Greek science was, in a sense, an epistemic revolution against the backdrop of the mythological worldview of the Greeks. And then, with the rise of Christianity, and the influx of ideas coming from the Hebraic worldview, it brought new challenges to the Hellenistic worldview. Of course, whether or not it was a revolution or a cultural adaptation, now that's a different matter, a different discussion. But continuously, we will see from time to time, there will be periods of epistemic revolution that threatens to challenge an order of knowledge, shall we say. And towards closer to our time, yes, from the Middle Age to the modern age, to the age of modernity, perhaps the most well-known revolution is the epistemic revolution of modernity, perhaps initiated in the early modern period by René Descartes, and then completed, shall we say, in the period of the Enlightenment through the concerted efforts of the various philosophers and the novelists, and the theologians and various thinkers. Chief amongst them, perhaps, is Immanuel Kant, but also the encyclopedists, those who wrote dictionaries to redefine key terms. There was a shift in order. So, again, to use the analogy of say revolution in the sciences, in the history of science, yes, Thomas Kuhn used the term paradigm shift, for example, between the geocentric worldview in science, in natural philosophy, to a heliocentric worldview. Now, that was an epistemic revolution. So, the question is, why is it that Professor Naqib al-Attas wants to bring about an epistemic revolution from the present order of knowledge, yes, the present way of how the world is conceived, conceptualized, presented in a cultural hegemonic way, shall we say, or in a knowledge regime, which is part and parcel of the Western knowledge practice, towards an Islamic conception of the world? Well, first and foremost, it has a lot to do with the Islamic conception of knowledge, which has elements which are contrary to the modern conception of knowledge. The Islamic conception of knowledge, of course, is based upon revelation. However, it does not preclude, it does not exclude, say, sense experience, history, meaning to say reports, as well as even our own rational instruments. In other words, logic is part and parcel of Islamic epistemology. These are all considered valid sources of knowledge. Yes, sound reason, sense experience, and true report are considered valid sources of knowledge, out of which you build the foundation of the Islamic conception of knowledge, including the Islamic conception of reality and truth, based first and foremost upon revelations, description of reality and truth, which includes, of course, the dunya and the akhirah, the reality of the human spirit, and so on and so forth. So in Islamizing the modern Western worldview, the Muslims must be aware of the nature of how Western knowledge is produced. It follows a particular programmatic structure, in particular the epistemology of empiricism and rationalism, a combination of logic and empiricism, which some may call, as per the Vienna school, they call it, say, logical empiricism. The Neo-Thomists call it empyreology, meaning to say the notion that what they consider valid is that which can be verified by reason, based on sense experience, as well as the modeling of the impacts of what can be experienced via the senses. And to this, we cannot accept that this is the totality of knowledge. And certainly, if that is how you conceive of knowledge or its sources, it will impact a lot of disciplines of knowledge. So, for example, this secularistic world picture, the mechanistic world picture, and that, say, disenchants nature, that removes nature of any spiritual meaning, it will affect how you conceive the human being. Certainly, this is different, because the conception of man in the Quran is not of a species which has derived and evolved from simpler modes of being into its being now. Islam does not consider the human being as a mere extension of the animal species, not just a physical, biological organism. Language, for example, in Islam, is not a mere accident in the evolutionary process. It's a creation. Man is a special creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Man has special duties and roles in this world. So therefore, the anthropology in Islam would be different from say, cultural anthropology that is based on a secular worldview. Economics would be different, certainly, because our conception of man would be inclusive of the idea that man is composed of both the animalistic as well as the spiritual aspect. But the animalistic aspect can be controlled, should be made to succumb to the spiritual aspect through religious practice, through ethical practice. And our ethics, likewise, derives from the Islamic worldview. It derives from religion. Our ethics derives from the notion of, say, the existence of an afterlife, of a judgment, of an ultimate judgment of our moral actions. So therefore, it makes total sense to Islamize knowledge once we understand that our worldviews are different. So Islamization is this process that is natural, whereby we sieve. There is a process of sifting. There is a process of checking the sort of knowledge that has been offered as knowledge to be as if it is neutral, to see whether or not it contains elements which are productive of the philosophic assumptions. And certainly philosophic assumptions play a role in what is considered knowledge and what is considered not knowledge. Also in the grading of knowledge, what would be considered knowledge, what would be the acceptable threshold before a supposed statement becomes worthy of knowledge. For example, in modern epistemology, we have terms such as, say, conjectures, hypotheses. Are these already sufficient to be graded as al-ilm, which is the Islamic conception of knowledge? Whereas we can have hawa and mira, meaning to say whims and say desires that can influence your conception of knowledge. Now, when we speak about conjectures and tentative knowledge, even Western epistemologists, yes, those who follow, say, the tradition of David Hume, yes, the likes of the modern, say, philosophers of science, some of them are willing to accept that, that you cannot have certain knowledge of the external world. What you may have are merely, say, practical, temporary and tentative conclusions that you are willing to revise in the light of more and more knowledge. Others consider doubt as a valid epistemological tool. For Professor Naqib al-Attas, it is not that doubt is rejected as part of the epistemological process, but to consider that doubt is the source of truth, as opposed to guidance. Now that is not something that is acceptable, because within the Islamic epistemological scheme, we affirm, say, the notion of shak, which is doubt, a condition of the soul torn between, say, two statements, neither able to affirm one or to reject the other. You arise to the station of conjecture, adhan, when you incline towards one, but you're unable to reject the other. But you move to the station of certainty once you can affirm that position, while at the same time you're capable of rejecting the other position. Now that's certainty. Only that counts as knowledge. And so it does not mean that every single statement has to arrive at the degree of knowledge. So that's why the strategic position taken by our scholars was to divide knowledge based on the value and the necessity of such knowledge. There are certain knowledge, or meaning to say certain disciplines of knowledge, which is ranked as fardu ain, meaning to say a type of knowing which is considered obligatory, and this must be able, you must possess, and this is something that you can arrive at as a matter of certitude. There are certain other knowledge which is pragmatic in nature. Now, the kind of knowledge which is pragmatic in nature is pursued for the sake of, shall we say, for the sake of your welfare, your personal, societal welfare in this world. Now, in these matters and these affairs, you can afford to hold on to, say, tentative conclusions, provided, of course, it is not mixed with falsehood. And you will be able to test whether a statement is full of falsehood or not. So that's why this notion of Islamization of knowledge should not be rejected outright. Now, in this chapter also, Professor Wan highlights the development of Islamic thought, particularly in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, until the time of the contemporaries of Professor Naqib al-Attas. Of course, the Muslims were aware of the challenges of Western knowledge. Amongst the early, amongst the early Muslims who came into contact, included, of course, scholars who flourished in Egypt, and those who also came to, say, the modern world, such as France, the likes of Muhammad Abduh, Rashid Rida, Al-Afghani, and even certain thinkers and scholars who came from, say, the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent. And of course, amongst the noteworthy scholars that he mentioned was Allama Iqbal. Allama Iqbal, to have received the sort of education that he did with the exposure of both Islamic and Western thought, was perhaps amongst one early response towards modern knowledge. You see, for example, in his lectures on the reconstruction of Islamic thought, Allama Iqbal was taking into consideration major aspects, profound aspects of Western thought. He was dealing with the recent developments in physics, the recent development in metaphysics. He was aware and studied the German idealistic tradition. He knew of the challenges coming from, say, existentialist psychology by Friedrich Nietzsche. He was aware also of the utilitarians, British philosophy, even say Henry Bergson and Whitehead and process philosophy, including of course Bertrand Russell. So Allama Iqbal knew about these aspects, and so he tried to present an original response to the modern Western knowledge. He was critical in some aspects of the modern worldview, particularly its atheistic aspect and its lack of direction due to its secularism. But in certain other aspects, because he was both critical of the West as well as the Muslims whose criticism he directed towards in order to improve their standing. He, for example, saw that in for example, in terms of his metaphysics, he was deeply influenced by the Sufi metaphysicians. This is evident not only in the lectures on the reconstruction, but even his thesis, the development of metaphysics of Persia. So amongst the other things that he noticed, yes, and this is characteristic of some other thinkers also, was that modern Europe, in terms of its epistemology, was an extension or a further development of the initial movement of thought in Islamic civilization, particularly through the Renaissance, and then gradually in the early modern and the Enlightenment periods. So therefore, since some of these aspects, especially what is interesting to note in Allama Iqbal is his identification of the birth of the inductive intellect as being the result of the Islamic civilization, whereas the Greek thought system was, due to the influence of Aristotle, relied on a lot of deductions, on definition of substance, and then to deduce out of that valid conclusions. But the Islamic intellectual tradition, in the likes of Ibn Haytham and several other Muslim scholars who pursued positive science, Ibn Nafis and several other Muslim scientists, they led to the birth of the inductive intellect, which is certainly extremely important for the development of natural sciences. So the birth of the inductive intellect was the work of, say, Islamic civilization that was then carried over by Western civilization. Of course, in Iqbal, the notion of Islamization perhaps did not become apparent, but certainly the great thinker poet is not to be faulted. But because this is an exponential body of knowledge that you come across. So to formulate a response to that is would take not only the experience of, say, great individuals and the acute observation of great individuals, but also will take the maturity of the experience of the civilization in encountering this, say, chaotic body of knowledge when perceived from without. Other great thinkers of the 20th century, interestingly, were the ones that Professor Wan have presented in this study, included, of course, the late Professor Ismail Faruqi, Professor Fazlur Rahman, and Professor Hussein Nasr. Now, these thinkers, including Professor Naqib al-Attas, were, I suppose, they were unique to in so far as not only were they steeped in their own culture, were they steeped in the Islamic intellectual tradition, but they had great exposure to Western culture and civilization. Ismail Faruqi, for example, had published a very brilliant study on Christian ethics. Professor Hussein Nasr, aside from being trained in, say, the geological sciences and the history of science in the West, also, of course, have written extensively on the history of Islamic science. Fazlur Rahman, likewise, despite having a strong traditional educational background, went on to study Ibn Sina's psychology, in great Western institutions. And at the same time, if you look at the studies of Fazlur Rahman, he was conversant in European languages, but which is inclusive of, say, Greek, and Latin and the modern European languages, and this is evident in the copious notes that he provides in his study on prophecy in Islam. And Fazlur Rahman, especially, if you look at his works on Avicenna psychology, prophecy in Islam, gradually you will see in the later works his analysis of Islamic civilization. But his views on modernity is particularly presented in his Islam and Modernity, which is a study of the encounter of Islamic education with Western modernity. And therein we find in Fazlur Rahman, the agenda he was more interested in was not the Islamization of knowledge per se. He was more concerned with what he called the double movement theory. He wanted first a return to the Quran as a totality, in the sense of the unity of the theological and the ethical message of the Quran, which is the foundation of the actions of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And having understood that, we return to our condition today with that renewed rigor, with that renewed energy in trying to reinfuse the secular the secular age, the secular society that we live in, with the moral spirit of the Quran. Similarly, in the case of Professor Hussein Nasser, he has given he was invited to deliver an important series of lectures, yes, which was then later titled the Knowledge and the Sacred, which deals with the problem of, say, the desacralization of knowledge, which is part and parcel of the secularization process, in which he presented a brilliant historical narrative of the desacralization of knowledge, from the early period, the Greek periods, down to the Christian Middle Ages until we reach the modern times. But even so, with regards to Professor Hussein Nasser, as Prof. Wan mentioned, the shall we say the strategy adopted was also influenced by his shall we say study and association with the perennialist tradition, as the likes of Fridtjof Schwann, Kumaraswamy, and several others amongst these perennialist school, with its own notion of tradition and its own notion of say critique of modernity and so on. So these thinkers, who were contemporaries of each other, cannot be said to have been, shall we say, responding to Islamization of knowledge per se, because they were, in a sense, they were contemporaries and they had their own agendas with regards to knowledge, while having, say, important differences and important similarities in their outlook. Now, of course, with regards to the agenda of Islamization of knowledge, we can say that amongst the names mentioned, the only one amongst them that other than Professor Naqib al-Attas, which we have discussed extensively, was Professor Ismail al-Faruqi, and through the institution called the Triple IT. He tried to develop his own understanding of Islamization in that institute, which led to publications and so on and so forth. You may refer further to the writings of Professor Wan, and of course the original writings, as to the details of the conception of Islamization of Faruqi, the ideas behind it, the causes of the Islam, the precipitation of the agenda in Faruqi. But as for responses, meaning to say either in agreement or disagreement with Islamization, I'd like to focus on several of the critiques against Islamization of knowledge. One of the critique is basically based on the notion that they consider that knowledge is knowledge. There's no such thing as Islamic knowledge, meaning to say science is science. There's no such thing as Islamic science. There is no Western science. There cannot be Hindu science. There cannot be Judaic science, and so on. Now, to this, we say that this notion of the rejection of the possibility of Islamic science, to say nothing about the other possibilities, is in fact unfounded. Some of them even went so far as to say that this notion of Islamization of science is a form of indigenization, to the extent that it does something that the Muslims of the past did not do. Meaning to say that the Muslims of the past considered, say, despite their coming into contact with external sources of knowledge, namely the Hellenizing type of knowledge, they accepted it, they appropriated it without Islamizing it. Well, we can agree perhaps that when Imam al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, and before that Al-Farabi appropriated, absorbed the learnings of the Greek, and removing from therefrom unsuitable notions, changing certain ideas and conceptions, that perhaps they did not use the term Islamization, that they did not call what they did not call their activity Islamization. But in practice, in effect, that was Islamization. Why is it that now there is such a thing that we will call certain things Islam? Why is this label important today, Islamic science, as opposed to, say, modern secular science? Well, this provided the process is done properly, provided we know the limits of the activity and the priority of the activity of Islamization, we can say that there is in fact Islamic science is that science which has underwent the process of Islamization, meaning to say the removal of the Western philosophic cultural assumptions which run contrary to the worldview of Islam. Some other thinkers consider that Islamization and de-Westernization of knowledge in their critique would be equivalent to rejection of Western, of the Western culture as a whole. In other words, they're saying that if we claim Islamic science and we profess to do de-Westernization, we would end up in a retrograde motion. We will return to a flat earthism. To begin with, Muslims, with few exceptions, yes, as a whole, in terms of, to take this particular reference, flat earthism, Muslims as a whole tended to respect the evidence of reason and the evidence of sense observation. So, in particular, in the positive sciences, the notion of a revolution in the natural sciences is not something alien to Islamic intellectual tradition. Islamization is not an ossification. We know, for example, that the theory of optics, yes, underwent a revolution during the Islamic period, and the observatory data, which is requisite for the Copernican revolution, was derived from the observatories of the Muslims, yes, including Ibn Shatir. So therefore, and many other sciences that came to be developed as the modern secular science were the result and the labor of Muslims, of Muslims who were confident in their revelation and who were confident in their worldview and who were confident of the status of themselves. So therefore, Islamization is not an indigenization. It is not a return to flat earthism. However, there is a proper room of rejecting, say, philosophical conclusions which are unfounded, which we have a right to disagree with. For example, we know that the rejection of metaphysics in modern day discourse is not something that can be established, demonstrated through positive science. Science do not possess the tools, nor the data, nor the capacity to reject metaphysics, because science relies on sense observation and the interpretation of reason. metaphysics, shall we say, has its own scheme, has its own sphere. And for us, metaphysics derives from revelation, and metaphysics and our conception of knowledge, as well as man's faculties of knowing, includes that of the spiritual organ of cognition called the heart. We have our own means, or human beings have the capacity and potentiality to know themselves, to know and verify the claims of revelation, and having accepted the claims of revelation, will have an alternative worldview, rejecting thereby the philosophical conclusions. So therefore, we can make room for scientific growth. We can make room for the growth of individual scientific disciplines even after Islamization, provided that the Islamization is done properly and not done in a piecemeal fashion. Not done in a, I don't mean piecemeal, the channel, but meaning to say separated from the totality of the teaching. So Islamization, especially with regards to language, with regards to human understanding. Now this can be done when properly understood. Others, mockingly or out of jest, they reject the movement of Islamization, saying that, well, if you so reject Western science, then you must reject the products of Western science, which is technology. Now, to this, interestingly, or to this very bizarre argument, we can say, well, technology and science can be distinguished, and we know that not only not only can the notion of commensurability between technologies be preserved, even aspects of scientific theories can be preserved in different worldviews. Let me give you an example. Well, the knife is a knife to the Muslim and the non-Muslim, and that's a piece of technology. So that is easy enough, isn't it? But in terms of science and theories, we know that in the history of science, there were several thinkers who were perhaps subscribing to some occult metaphysical scheme. Perhaps it was attributed to Kepler, a belief which is not the modern secular belief, but yet in terms of his understanding of cosmology, it is similar or in the same tradition as Galileo, Giordano Bruno, and so on. So that means to say people who have different metaphysical assumptions and commitments can subscribe to the same scientific description of a particular aspect of phenomena. And Imam al-Ghazali has already pointed to this in his Tahafatul Falasifa. He mentions that the number of planets there are and their sphere of rotations, yes, their sphere, the size of their orbit. Now these things are, shall we say, these things are not the matter of religion. These things are not the matter of metaphysics. They have no impact on your aqidah. So it means it is up to the evidence of science. It is up to the evidence of observation whether or not this is true or not. And similarly, with regards to technology, we can argue that back to the knife example, Professor al-Attas gives this analogy that the same knife in the hands of a housewife or in the hands of a cook, shall we say, it becomes a useful instrument. Now that same knife, were a robber, a burglar to break into one's house, and he picks up that same knife which was in the hands of the lady or the one wielding the knife previously was an instrument, suddenly becomes a weapon. Now that's technology, isn't it? Or at least to a certain extent. We know that, for example, certain technologies would not have been developed, would not have been pursued to its extreme ends if the worldview of Islam is intact. We know, for example, that we cannot in our we cannot in our conscience with our conscience and with our sane minds develop certain destructive technologies. even though later on that the effects of the destructive technologies can be used as a technological imprint to develop further technologies which become useful. But nevertheless, we know that where technology is concerned, provided the worldview is intact, it is not necessary to subscribe to the same metaphysical conclusions and commitments. We can preserve our worldview. And why is it that we want to preserve our worldview? Is because our identity relies on it, our ethical system relies on it, our societal system relies on it, the balance of ecology relies on it also. One chief reason that Professor Al-Attas, one strong argument that he put in the 5th chapter of Islam and Secularism, the one on, say, the westernization of knowledge, was that the argument that the modern conception of knowledge was the one responsible to the possibilities of the destruction of the three kingdoms of nature, the vegetal, the animal, and the mineral. And why is that? Because this new conception of knowledge makes man lose understanding of himself, makes man not know what are limits when it comes to the plunder of natural resources. It makes man lose the notion of virtue, to be replaced by values. And once values have become the mainstay of ethics, that value became transferred into monetary valuation, meaning to say from virtue, which has the notion of limits and discipline, it becomes a matter of value, to what you like, to what you consider worthy of preservation. Gradually it became more and more corrupted until it is a matter of I see a personal preference, and gradually to the pursuit of hedonistic ends and so on, and how you cannot judge other people if they wish to pursue say a destructive course of action, until gradually we come to the impasse that we are in today. So that these are some of the responses and our counter responses to the Islamization of knowledge. As a final restatement of the importance of this epistemic revolution, I should just like to say that if knowledge fulfills its function in human beings, then that knowledge, to go back to the definition of education as the process of instilling adab, will allow a human being to understand his role in this world, her role in this world, to understand his or her purpose in this world vis-a-vis God, that the purpose in this world is to know God, that the purpose in this world is to serve humanity in relation to serving God, that the purpose in this world is to know oneself as his servant and to perform one's role as his vicegerent. And as vicegerents of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the role of man is also reflective of his happiness. And freedom, likewise, is defined in such a manner. And so with that ends our brief survey of the educational philosophy and practice of Sayyid Muhammad Naqib al-Attas. Of course, I would implore all of you to read the work yourself and try to read it a number of times and discuss the contents. Works of this nature will require several repetitions of reading, and several different types of reading, and several methods in approaching its recondite matters. But I will assure you that it is something fulfilling, because what is contained therein is nothing short of shall we say a program that can resolve the problems of the Muslims. Well, I have, I think, shared what I wish to share in this session. I would like to invite any of those of you present to ask questions if you do have any. If the questions come later, you can you can still send a private message to Peacemeal, and they will then forward it to Professor Wan, who will inshallah do the khatam of this work on this coming Thursday. But you will have to register for this particular event. We can gather your questions and we can forward it to him and to show him in which he will address them. Are there any questions that you'd like to be answered today though? Well then, if there isn't, then I would like to take this opportunity to thank everyone for having followed this long series. Alhamdulillah, we have completed the work, discussing the work chapter by chapter. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us understanding, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us beneficial knowledge. With that, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.